autumn of 1918, the British Army's most accurate battle rifle was being built in Pennsylvania. Not at Enfield Lock, not at Birmingham Small Arms, not at any factory on British soil. At a purpose-built plant in Eddystone, a small industrial borough on the Delaware River southwest of Philadelphia, American workers were producing the patent 1914 rifle at a rate of nearly 3,000 units per day under British government contract. Winchester was building it in New Haven. Remington was building it in Ilion, New York. By the armistice, American factories had delivered more than 1.2 million of them to the British Crown. The Empire's most precise military rifle, designed at Enfield, rejected by the War Office before the war began, then desperately ordered in quantities that British industry could not supply, had been saved by the Connecticut River Valley gun trade. But the real story of the pattern 1914 is not the American factories that built it. It is the story of a rifle that was too accurate for peacetime, indispensable in war, and never quite given the recognition it deserved in any country that carried it. Every week on this channel, we follow the decisions, the institutions, and the engineering arguments that shaped the weapon's history, remembers, and the ones it overlooked. Subscribe if that matters to you. The story begins at Enfield Lock, Middlesex, in 1900. By the turn of the 20th century, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock had been the institutional heart of British military rifle production for more than half a century. It stood on the River Lee in Middlesex, 11 miles north of central London. A walled factory complex of brick and iron, its machinery driven first by water wheel and later by steam, its workforce trained in the specific and demanding discipline of military small arms manufacture. The ordnance factories at Enfield had produced the patent 1853 Enfield musket, the Martini Henry, the Lee Metford, and the Lee Enfield. Every generation of British soldiers since the Crimea had carried a rifle that began as a drawing at Enfield Lock. The Lee Enfield, formerly the short magazine Lee Enfield, or SMLE, adopted in 1904, was the current service rifle. And it was, by almost every military metric, a formidable weapon. Its 10-round detachable magazine was double the capacity of the German Gewehr 98. Its cock-on-closing bolt action allowed a trained infantryman to deliver 15 aimed rounds per minute, a rate of fire that would astonish German troops at Mons in August 1914, who initially reported they were facing machine guns. The SMLE was fast, reliable, and robust under field conditions. But it had a problem, and the men who shot competitively knew exactly what it was. The Lee bolt action was a rear locking design. The locking lugs, the steel projections that secured the bolt against the chamber pressure of a fired cartridge, engaged at the rear of the receiver rather than directly behind the chamber. This arrangement contributed to the SMLE's speed. It also contributed to a degree of flex in the action under firing stress that the most demanding target shooters could measure in their groups at distance. At Bisley, the National Rifle Association's ranges in Surrey, where Britain's finest competitive marksmen gathered each summer, the SMLE's long-range accuracy was a standing subject of debate. At 600 yards and beyond, the rifle that had been designed for the rapid fire of infantry engagements was showing the limitations of a bolt action optimized for speed rather than precision. The men who shot at Bisley were not cavalrymen or colonial administrators. They were engineers, gunsmiths, and former soldiers who understood the interior ballistics of their rifles as intimately as they understood the wind at the 1,000-yard range. When they said the Lee action was not accurate enough at distance, they were not expressing a preference. They were reporting a measurement. At the Royal Small Arms Factory, a group of designers, working within the institutional framework of Ordnance Board approval and War Office procurement, began development of an entirely new rifle. The brief was specific: front-locking bolt action, stronger and stiffer than the Lee system, a longer sight radius than the SMLE, a fully enclosed aperture rear sight, adjustable for elevation and protected from damage in the field. A Mauser pattern magazine, non-detachable, 5 rounds, loaded by stripper clip. The result of this development program was submitted to the Ordnance Board in stages between 1910 and 1913 under the designation Pattern 1913. The Pattern 1913 was chambered in a new experimental cartridge, a 276-inch round designed to offer a flatter trajectory than the standard .303 British. Trials at Enfield and Hythe were promising. The rifle shot with a precision that the SMLE could not match at range. The Ordnance Board examined it, tested it, and then set it aside. The .303 British cartridge was already in service in every rifle, machine gun, and naval weapon across the Empire. The logistical argument against a new caliber was overwhelming. The War Office concluded that the existing Lee Enfield, supplemented by continued production improvements, was sufficient for the Army's needs. The Pattern 1913 was shelved. 2 years later, the war that nobody had quite planned for arrived. The outbreak of war in August 1914 immediately exposed a gap between what the British Army had and what it was going to need. The SMLE was the service rifle. It would remain the service rifle. There was neither the time nor the industrial capacity to introduce a new weapon. But the casualty figures of the first months, the battles of Mons, the Marne, First Ypres, consumed rifles faster than the factories at Enfield, Birmingham Small Arms, and the London Small Arms Company could replace them. By the end of 1914, the War Office was facing a production shortfall of serious proportions. The answer, reached in early 1915, was to adapt the Pattern 1913 design for the standard .303 British cartridge, eliminating the caliber problem entirely, and to contract its manufacture to American industry, where spare precision machining capacity existed that British factories could not provide. The adaptation was straightforward in principle, more demanding in execution. The chamber was recut for .303. The magazine was redesigned for the rimmed British cartridge, which had different feeding characteristics from the rimless round the P14 had been designed around. The resulting weapon was designated the Pattern 1914 rifle, Mark I. It was, in physical terms, a different proposition from the SMLE, where the Lee Enfield's bolt handle lay forward and close to the body, designed to be cycled rapidly without breaking the firing grip. The P14's handle swept back and down in the Mauser pattern, requiring a more deliberate movement but providing a more positive lockup. The front locking lugs, two opposed steel projections that engaged their recesses directly behind the chamber, created a receiver that flexed measurably less under firing pressure than the Lee system. The rear sight was the P14's most distinctive feature, where the SMLE used an open-notch battle sight. Supplemented by a folding leaf, the P14 carried a fully enclosed aperture, a circular hole in a steel disc, adjustable for elevation from 200 to 1,050 yards by a knurled drum, protected on both sides by fixed steel wings that prevented accidental adjustment and shielded the sight from knocks in the field. The human eye naturally centers a circle within a circle with greater precision than it aligns a post within a notch. This was not theory. It was measurable. At 600 yards, the P14's sight system delivered a consistency of aim that the open sights of the SMLE could not replicate. The barrel was heavier than the SMLE's and slightly longer, 26 inches against the short Lee Enfield's 25.2, with a corresponding increase in sight radius. The stock was a full-length design, the handguard running almost to the muzzle, giving the rifle a solid, substantial feel that marksmen accustomed to target rifles recognized immediately. The War Office now needed this rifle in quantities that British industry could not supply. In the spring and summer of 1915, contracts were placed with 3 American manufacturers. Winchester Repeating Arms Company, New Haven, Connecticut, already producing rifle actions to find tolerances for the commercial market, received a contract for 200,000 rifles. Remington Arms Company, operating from its Ilion, New York facility, the factory on the site where Eliphalet Remington had forged his first barrel in 1816, received a contract for a further tranche of production. And Winchester, recognizing that its New Haven factory could not absorb the full volume required, helped establish and equip an entirely new facility at Eddystone, Pennsylvania, the Eddystone Rifle Plant, incorporated in 1915 specifically to fulfill British government contracts. It would become, for the duration of the war, the single largest producer of the pattern 1914. Each manufacturer's rifles were marked with the first letter of the factory's name. W for Winchester, R for Remington, E for Eddystone. Stamped into the receiver ring alongside the British broad arrow proof mark and the War Office Inspector's cartouche. These markings matter to collectors and historians today. They distinguish the production runs, their dates, and the subtle manufacturing variations between three factories working to the same specification 3,000 miles from the country that had designed the rifle. The institutional moat was not a patent. It was a War Office adoption. The moment a government accepted a weapon into service, specified it as the standard of manufacture, and tied the productive capacity of three major American factories to its continued production. Once that lock-in existed, the pattern 1914 was not simply a design. It was a system. By 1916, it was arming the empire. The pattern 1914 reached the Western Front in quantity during 1916, issued primarily to second-line and garrison troops, while the SMLE remained the front-line standard. But it was in one specific role that the P14 found its true institutional identity. And it was a role that no military planner had specifically designed it for. Sniping. The trench warfare that had solidified by late 1914 created conditions that rewarded precision above almost all other tactical virtues. A sniper at 600 yards who could place a round within 2 inches of his point of aim could dominate a section of trench. A rifle that could deliver that precision consistently in the hands of a trained man was worth more in that specific application than any number of rifles optimized for infantry volume fire. The P14's aperture sight, its heavy barrel, its stiff front-locking action, every characteristic that had made it marginally slower to cycle than the Lee Enfield made it inherently more accurate from a supported firing position. British Army sniping schools, established in response to catastrophic early losses to German snipers, adopted the pattern 1914 as their weapon of choice when fitted with a telescope sight. The Aldis scope, and later the PP-Com and periscopic prism company optics, were mounted on the P14's left receiver wall using a claw pattern mount that did not require the removal of the bolt, a practical refinement that experienced snipers valued immediately. Across the Ypres salient on the Somme, in the Arras sector and the Cambrai approaches, British and Commonwealth snipers carrying the P14 accumulated a record of effectiveness that the War Office documented, though selectively, in the operational reports that survive at Kew. The rifle became, in institutional terms, the British Army's precision instrument of the Western Front. Meanwhile, in America, the production story was taking a turn that nobody in London had quite anticipated. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Forces faced an immediate rifle shortage. The standard U.S. service rifle, the Springfield M1903, a refined Mauser pattern weapon chambered in .30-06, was being produced at Springfield Armory and Rock Island Arsenal, but not in sufficient quantities to arm the millions of men now being mobilized. The three American factories already producing the pattern 1914 for Britain were the obvious solution. The adaptation required was, in principle, minor. Rechamber for the American .30-06 cartridge, modify the magazine for the rimless American round, and redesignate accordingly. The resulting weapon was formally adopted as the United States Rifle caliber .30, model of 1917, universally known as the M1917 Enfield, or simply the American Enfield. It was, in mechanical terms, the same rifle. The same front-locking action, the same enclosed aperture sight, the same heavy barrel, the same full-length stock, the same manufacturing philosophy, built to tolerances that the Ordnance Department specified and the factory inspectors enforced with the tenacity of men who understood what a failed extractor meant to a soldier in a trench. The M1917 became the most numerous American rifle of the First World War. This is a fact that American military history has not always emphasized clearly, because the M1903 Springfield carries the prestige of a purpose-designed American weapon and the romantic associations of the Marine Corps and the AEF's crack units, but the arithmetic is unambiguous. Of the roughly 3.5 million rifles carried by American soldiers in the war, approximately 2.1 million were M1917s. The Springfield M1903 was the minority weapon. The Enfield, a rifle designed at a British factory on the River Lee in Middlesex, was the rifle that armed the American Expeditionary Forces. Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone produced M1917s at a combined rate that reached 10,000 units per day at peak capacity in 1918. Eddystone alone delivered 1,081,908 M1917 rifles between 1917 and 1918, a production record for a single military small arms facility in American history to that point. The human dimension of that production was a factory floor that bore no resemblance to the skilled gunsmith workshops of a generation before. Women trained on milling machines and barrel-straightening presses. Men who had spent their working lives in textile mills or foundries were retrained on precision lathes within weeks, calibrating their work to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The inspector's rejection rate at Eddystone in the early months of production ran above 30%, parts machined incorrectly, dimensions out of specification, actions that would not pass proof, before the workforce achieved the consistency the contract demanded. The stake sentence that every production supervisor on those factory floors understood. If the extractor on an M1917 failed to withdraw a spent .30-06 case from the chamber during a night engagement in the Argonne forest, the soldier holding it had for the duration of a bolt manipulation that would take him 2 or 3 seconds in darkness and fear. A single-shot weapon with no margin for mechanical failure. The most celebrated confirmed use of the M1917 in the First World War was at the Battle of the Argonne on 8 October 1918. Corporal Alvin C. York of the 82nd Division, a Tennessee marksman who had grown up hunting in the Cumberland Mountains and who understood instinctively the relationship between a calm breath, a steady front sight, and a result, led an assault that killed 25 German soldiers and captured 132 prisoners, an action for which he received the Medal of Honor. York's weapon that day was the M1917 Enfield. The aperture rear sight that the Bisley marksman had argued for at Enfield Lock 15 years earlier was the sight through which he fired. By the armistice of November 1918, the combined British and American production of pattern 1914 and M1917 rifles had exceeded 2.5 million units. The rifle that the War Office had shelved in 1913 as unnecessary had become, in 4 years, one of the most widely produced military bolt-action rifles in history. The armistice did not retire the pattern 1914. It simply changed the context in which the rifle would have to justify its continued existence. In Britain, the immediate post-war period saw the War Office confront an enormous surplus of military small arms. Lee Enfields and pattern 1914s stored in depots from Woolwich to Weedon, the accumulated inventory of a nation that had armed millions and now needed to stand them down. The SMLE remained the service rifle. The P14 was placed in reserve. The factories that had produced it, Eddystone, the Winchester and Remington war production lines, were stood down, converted, or redirected to commercial work. The pattern 1914 had no civilian market to fall into. It was not a commercial product. It had never been sold across a counter. It had been designed, manufactured, and issued entirely within the institutional framework of military procurement. And when that procurement ended, the rifle had nowhere to go except into storage. In America, the M1917 faced a similar institutional limbo. The Springfield M1903 was the prestige weapon, the rifle the Marine Corps carried, the rifle associated with American marksmanship tradition, the rifle whose Mauser-derived action American ordnance officers had spent a decade refining. The M1917, for all its quantitative dominance of the AEF's war, was quietly assigned to reserve status in the 1920s. The Springfield retained its place as the standard American service rifle into the 1930s. The structural force at work here was not competition or bankruptcy. It was the compressed decline of the institutional weapon. A single customer, the government, had moved on, and there was no secondary market to sustain the design. The Second World War provided a second act that the rifle had not been expected to deliver. When Britain rearmed in the late 1930s, the War Office found itself in a position uncomfortably similar to 1915. The Patton 1914s in storage, maintained in Greece, sealed in crates in depots across the country, were issued first to the Home Guard, the civilian defense force established in May 1940 as invasion threatened. For men who had never fired a military rifle, the P14's aperture sight and its stable, accurate action were, paradoxically, advantages. The rifle demanded patience rather than speed. It rewarded deliberate aim. For a Home Guard volunteer shooting from a prepared position at a predictable approach route, those were exactly the qualities required. In the sniping role that had defined it in the First World War, the Patton 1914 returned to operational service again. No dedicated British sniper rifle existed at the outbreak of the Second World War. The Lee Enfield No. 4 P14, the purpose-built sniper variant of the updated service rifle, did not reach units until 1942-43. In the interim, Patton 1914 rifles fitted with telescopic sights served with British forces in the Western Desert, in the early campaigns in North Africa, and in other theaters where the rifle's inherent accuracy at range remained an operational asset. But the interim was exactly what it was. By 1943, the No. 4T was available in sufficient numbers to replace the P14 in the sniper role. By 1945, the Patton 1914 was passing into its final institutional retirement. The self-loading rifle era that followed the Second World War made the bolt-action service weapon redundant in every major military. The L1A1 SLR, the British Commonwealth version of the FNFAL, adopted in 1957, replaced the Lee Enfield family entirely and rendered the P14 a museum piece in military terms. No further government contracts were possible. No further procurement cycles would bring it back. The last door closed quietly. No bankruptcy filing. No Chapter 11. No private equity extraction. Simply, a government that no longer needed the rifle it had once needed desperately. The factories that had built it were long gone. Eddystone demolished. Its site absorbed into the industrial geography of the Delaware Valley. The Winchester war production lines converted to commercial work decades before. The Remington Ilion factory producing other things for other customers. The Patton 1914 passed from service weapon to surplus. From surplus to store. From store to the collectors who understood what it represented. The Patton 1914 never achieved the iconic status of the Lee Enfield it was designed to surpass. That fact is itself a piece of historical evidence worth examining. The SMLE, the short magazine Lee Enfield, became one of the most celebrated military rifles in history, the subject of regimental histories, collectors' associations, and a body of technical literature that spans more than a century. The Patton 1914 did not. It was faster than the SMLE in going obsolete, less romantically associated with the stoic British infantryman, and its most distinguished production story, the American factories, has always sat awkwardly with the rifle's British identity. And yet the rifle's secondary market tells a different story from its institutional neglect. Surviving Patton, 1914 and M1917 examples, particularly those from the early war production runs at Winchester, Remington, and Eddystone, retaining their original military finish and proof cartouches, have appreciated steadily in the collector market. Rock Island Auction Company lots featuring matched numbers P14 rifles in original configuration regularly achieve prices that reflect the rifle's growing reputation among serious collectors of First and Second World War British arms. The factory marking, W, R, or E, stamped into the receiver ring, has become, for collectors, a provenance indicator of the first order. An Eddystone P14 in unissued condition, its barrel still carrying the bright lands of a rifle that was never fired in anger, represents a specific and unrepeatable intersection of American industrial capacity and British military desperation. The M1917's collector community in the United States has long maintained that the American Enfield is the most undervalued bolt-action military rifle of the 20th century. That is a collector's argument, and collectors have their own interests. But the technical case is not easily dismissed. A production standard, M1917, shot from a supported position at 600 yards with period ammunition, will deliver groups that most modern commercial bolt-action rifles would not be embarrassed by. The action is strong, stronger by measurable engineering standards than the Lee system it was designed to replace. The sight is genuinely excellent. The rifle works. At the Royal Armouries in Leeds, and in the pattern room collection maintained by Nottingham Trent University from the original Enfield lock records, the development sequence of the P13 and P14 is preserved. The experimental 276 prototypes, the 303 conversion samples, the successive Ordnance Board approval drawings, the physical evidence of the argument that Enfield's designers made to the War Office between 1910 and 1913, and the argument the War Office rejected, is traceable in the metal of surviving trial pieces. The surprise footnote, and it is a genuine one, is the sight. The enclosed aperture sight of the pattern 1914 did not die with the rifle. The principle, a rear aperture protected by fixed wings, adjustable by elevation drum, sighted to a precise front post, informed the development of military rifle sighting systems across multiple nations. The American M1 Garand's rear sight, adopted in the 1930s, owes a direct engineering lineage to the aperture sight refined at Enfield Lock. The rear sight of the M1 carbine, the aperture arrangements of post-war service rifles across NATO, the specific mechanical insight that Bisley marksmen had been advocating since the late 19th century, that the human eye centers a circle more precisely than it notches a post, became, through the pattern 1914's wartime adoption and the M1917's mass production, a validated engineering principle that shaped military small arms sighting for the rest of the century. The pattern. 1914 was not the rifle that the British Army chose. It was the rifle the British Army reached for when the rifle it had chosen was not enough. That distinction carries its own weight. The history of military procurement is partly the history of what peacetime institutions select, the practical, the affordable, the logistically convenient, and partly the history of what those same institutions discover they actually need when the shooting starts and the margin for adequacy disappears. The pattern 1914 was designed by men who understood the second category. It was rejected by men responsible for the first. Then the war arrived and made the argument moot. It was built in New Haven and Ilion and Eddystone. It was carried in the Ypres salient and the Argonne forest and the Western Desert. It was issued to Home Guard volunteers in the summer of 1940 who drilled in village halls and watched the Channel for invasion. It was used by snipers who understood its qualities in ways that general-issue soldiers never needed to. And somewhere in a collection in Yorkshire or Pennsylvania or New South Wales, a pattern 1914 with its original military finish intact, its receiver stamped with the broad arrow and the factory letter, its aperture sight still tracking cleanly through its full range of elevation, sits exactly as accurate as the day it left the factory, doing what the men at Enfield Lock designed it to do, waiting for a steady hand and a calm breath and a target at 600 yards. This channel covers the rifles, the factories, and the institutional decisions that shaped what soldiers carried into the defining conflicts of the modern era. If the pattern 1914 brought you here, the Lee Enfield story, the rifle that replaced it in the field while it replaced the Lee Enfield in the sniper's hide, is the next one worth your time. See you in the next one.